Welcome back. Today, we're counting down the 48 highest paid head coaches at the FIFA World Cup 2026, from the lowest salary to the highest. Let's get started. Dick Advocat of Curaçao earns $111,000 per year. Bubista of Cabo Verde earns $128,000 per year. Darren Baisley of New Zealand earns $151,000 per year. Hassam Hassan of Egypt earns $181,000 per year. Miroslav Kubek of Czechia earns $209,000 per year. Sebastian Migny of Haiti earns $220,000 per year. Serge Barbarez of Bosnia and Herzegovina earns $267,000 per year. Jamal Salami of Jordan earns $348,000 per year. Amir Galanoai of Iran earns $383,000 per year. Sabri Lamouchi of Tunisia earns $406,000 per year. Sebastian Desabre of DR Congo earns $499,000 per year. Steve Clark of Scotland earns $580,000 per year. Stale Solbakken of Norway earns $667,000 per year. Graham Potter of Sweden earns $673,000 per year. Graham Arnold of Iraq earns $702,000 per year. Tony Popovich of Australia earns $702,000 per year. Thomas Christensen of Panama earns $841,000 per year. Walid Regragui of Morocco earns $899,000 per year. Imers Faye of Côte d'Ivoire earns $951,000 per year. Hajime Moriyasu of Japan earns $1.00 million per year. Hugo Bruce of South Africa earns $1.04 million per year. Pape Theo of Senegal earns $1.07 million per year. Carlos Queiroz of Ghana earns $1.08 million per year. Hervé Renard of Saudi Arabia earns $1.21 million per year. Vladimir Petkovic of Algeria earns $1.60 million per year. Zlatko Dalic of Croatia earns $1.74 million per year. Ralf Rangnick of Austria earns $1.74 million per year. Murat Yakin of Switzerland earns $1.86 million per year. Rudy Garcia of Belgium earns $1.97 million per year. Luis de la Fuente of Spain earns $2.32 million per year. Sebastián Becassis of Ecuador earns $2.32 million per year. Nestor Lorenzo of Colombia earns $2.32 million per year. Hong Myung-bo of South Korea earns $2.51 million per year. Vincenzo Montella of Turkey earns $2.55 million per year. Julian Lopetegui of Qatar earns $2.78 million per year. Gustavo Alfaro of Paraguay earns $2.90 million per year. Javier Aguirre of Mexico earns $2.90 million per year. Jesse Marsh of Canada earns $2.90 million per year. Marcelo Bielsa of Uruguay earns $3.48 million per year. Ronald Koeman of the Netherlands earns $3.48 million per year. Lionel Scaloni of Argentina earns $3.48 million per year. Didier Deschamps of France earns $4.41 million per year. Fabio Cannavaro of Uzbekistan earns $4.64 million per year. Roberto Martinez of Portugal earns $4.64 million per year. Julian Nagelsmann of Germany earns $5.57 million per year. Mauricio Pochettino of the United States earns $6.03 million per year. Thomas Tuchel of England earns $6.73 million per year. Carlo Ancelotti of Brazil earns $11.02 million per year.